Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Basics, a project by Talking League. It's Jason and Brenton in here for the 11th edition, Brenton, and we're going to go through pods versus the peloton. This is a very, very big topic in NRL fantasy. Obviously, we love our pods at Talking League, but there's also a strategy at the start of the season to make sure you don't find yourself way behind the pack.
Yeah, 100%. There's always going to be the players who you really, really want to have, but are you taking a point of difference player just for the sake of being a pod play, or is there strategy behind it?
That's exactly right. But first, mate, we better go back into what pods are, and as we can see, they're point of difference players, low ownership. I've got here 10% considered a pod. Is that something that you think changes throughout the season once we can work out what sort of classes of coaches, like the top 1K, own X amount of this particular player?
Yeah, I think it changes throughout the season. I think a pod play is normally someone under 5% to start with. And then by the end of the season, it probably creeps up to that 10 because a lot of the teams do start to look eerily similar. So, yeah, I think at the moment it's 5% when you're starting the season.
Yeah, so keep that in mind, guys. Anything above 5, you can brag to your mates about having a really, really good pod. And, obviously we're going to explore it in this episode. The thing about point of difference players is they're your real as it says in the name, they're real difference makers, because if they go really well, you can shoot up the top. If you get a few of them that go really poorly, it can really put you behind the 8 ball.
Well, it can, and at the same time, if you're taking the pod early on and it turns out that you've have been successful, then all the other people are going to be using those precious few trades at the very first 6 rounds to try and get those players where you've already got him, and you can go on to the next part and get ahead of the pack that way.
Yeah, that's right. And like you said, precious trades, you only get 2 per round. And if you've got injured players, like sometimes you just won't be able to get those guys because the combination of cash for those players you're trading out doesn't allow you to get that player. But let's start on the science of high ownership, because obviously for people that are new to NRL Fantasy, Brenton, they would look at the stats center, see these high ownership players, and for a lot of them, they'd be asking why these players are so highly owned. And like, we've got here 3 main categories, and I think the first one is probably one that coaches that are newer to NRL Fantasy need to be aware of.
Exactly right, and it's essentially where the game of NRL doesn't translate sometimes to NRL fantasy, and especially now. I guess back in the day, about 10 years ago, if you picked up a Billy Slater in fantasy, you'd be considered crazy. Where obviously he's one of the greatest fullbacks ever. So the game translates a little bit differently, not just off a great NRL player.
Yes, and we've gone through this series with our Foran versus Brown comparison. That very much fits into here. The other category that we're always going to see is with our highest price players, the guys that we're looking at as captaincy choices, they're generally going to be high ownership. And, as long as you've got one of those guys, if not, say, 2 of them that are highly owned, and you've got the captaincy on one of them, you're probably not going to fall too far behind on your captaincy if you're sticking it on the same player each week.
Exactly right. And I think there's so much data out there to have for which players are actually going to be the guns and give you the most consistent scores. And especially this year, it's going to be quite a little bit easier to hold a few of them so you don't have to continually play that captaincy roulette.
Yeah, which is a strategy we're going to talk about in the upcoming episodes around your captaincy. And then the other category we've got here, and this is the one where coaches need to be tuned in. These cash cows, the cut price keepers, or just other generally underpriced players, they're the ones that we want to make sure we get on. And we've obviously got an example of one here, in one Terrell May, who's 670k. And for me, he's very much a person who should be owned by everyone in the peloton. So for those that haven't heard the phrase the peloton before, it's a cycling phrase. It's generally where the main pack of riders sit. You obviously got the guys up the front, and then the guys at the back that you don't want to be a part of up the back. You want to be at least in the middle. And with Terrell May, he's probably close to the most obvious pick this year, you reckon?
For the must-haves, apart from probably Nathan Cleary, I think so. I know he was one of the first, he was the second player picked on my board because we saw what he did at the Roosters when he got given the minutes, and that's what we are expecting him to have at the Tigers.
Yes, and an added bonus as well with the Tigers. They don't have a bye in that first 11 rounds in 2025 before the Origin period, so you do know that even if, say, Terrell May was to get picked for Origin, which you'd probably be scoring awesome in fantasy if that were the case, you are going to get him for 11 rounds and have him there. When the Panthers are on a bye in round 11, you can maybe whack the captaincy on him. And he's the great archetype player here that we would only look to antipod, which is to go away from a player that is highly owned, if we had a specific reason. And, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head for Terrell, mate. I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't start with him because, yeah, maybe he got inconsistent minutes at the Roosters, but we're going to make the assumption Benji's signed this guy, worked really hard to get him to the club. He's going to give him some minutes to score some points.
Yeah, 100%. So there's no real reason that sticks out for me of why you would not take him, and that reflects his ownership as well. Whereas you have a look at the guys like, maybe like an Isaiah Yeo, who you think, oh, they're actually full priced, but they're 28% owned. Why is that? Do I think there's value, or can I go somewhere who's a little bit more cut price, like a Payne Haas, and save myself 40 grand that way?
Yeah, and that's a perfect example of finding a reason to not pick a high-end player. So, full disclosure, in 2025, I'm going to start with Isaiah Yeo in round one, but he's certainly not a must-have. And there's going to be people, like you said, that'll go Payne Haas, or they might go for Jermaine Hopgood or another player instead. And it's about understanding why there's certain players that have that high ownership. And if you can't find a decent reason to not have them, then just throw them in your team and look for differences elsewhere. Because we hear this all the time, Brenton. All teams are the same. It gets boring. And I think there's a few things to that. I mean, obviously, the best players later in the season are going to be owned by most coaches because they're the ones scoring the most points, and that's how you're going to go high up the ranks. But I've got a screenshot here, and look, this is a bit dated from when we're recording this, but we're looking at the highest priced winger fullbacks here. And what we can see on this graphic is Latrell Mitchell's 18.99. Obviously, he's been injured since this graphic. We've got James Tedesco at 3.92. Dylan Edwards, the Devil, at 6.66%. Kalen Ponga at 21.64%. And Jaden Campbell at 1.23%. We can see here that even when you add these percentages up, they don't relate to 100. So it's quite clear that in some positions this year, there's going to be natural variation, and therefore all teams are not going to look the same.
Yeah, exactly right. And they do end up looking a little bit the same for the high performing coaches at the back end, because they've been able to make the judgments on performance that's happened through the year. But when you're setting your team up, it can go to balance. Like, you might be going heavily in the mids because you don't think there's as much value in the wing fullback of taking a gun. Or you might want to run two gun halves, or you might be wanting to run a Dylan Lucas in the center, which takes out, 400 grand from the cheapies. So it all goes on to squad balance and what your preference is and where you see the value at in other players.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So just think about that when you're seeing, if you go on an NRL Fantasy Talk or any other spot where you're seeing teams that have, 15, 16 players in common, there's still 4 or 5 of those players that are different, and they could be the ones that make the difference. And we want to explore that because we've obviously just spoken about, high ownership players, pick them, be risk averse and all that. But there is something to be said for picking some good pods, because at the start of the season, those 4 or 5 players might be the only differentiation factor between you and 20,000 other teams. And I think the thing that we really want to stress when picking pods is we encourage it, be bold, be brave, pick players you like, is that make sure the fact that their ownership is low is not the main reason for picking them. You need to see some value there.
Yeah, that's it. And the one example I can think of right now who's in my team is Matt Burton. He's about 3% owned. But I can see value in him. I've done the research on what he's like when he plays with Toby Sexton. They're going to have a full preseason together. So I have reason to believe that he's about 5 points undervalued. And I'm willing to take a risk on that. So therefore I can also do other things with my squad where I don't have Isaiah Yeo in that case. But if I think there's only 5 to 7 points between them, where the price point is about 11 points, then there's something else that I can do with my side.
Yeah, and that's it. And what you mentioned there as well is Matt Burton is sort of, the trimmings of your team. You've probably 14, 15 of your players are probably quite highly owned. And then you've got a couple of guys like Matt Burton that are underneath that 5%. And if they go well, that's great. You're going to get ahead of the pack. But if they don't go that well, then if it's only a couple of players underperforming, you're probably not going to fall too far behind.
That's it. And they're also quite high price as well. So you do have the flexibility to move to someone of a similar price point if they're not doing what you need them to do, where that makes it a bit different to the failed cash cows, where it's hard to move them because they are only 250 grand and you probably don't have much salary cap there.
No, and that's right. And then that's when, if you don't have one of those, say a Matt Burton, an expensive player that doesn't get hurt, suspended, or gives you a reason to trade them out, it can get very awkward because you have a guy like, bless him, Tommy Tillau for me in 2023, held him all season, made no cash for me and was, basically a red dot most rounds. If you've got this guy like Matt Burton that doesn't do well, gets hurt or whatever, you can trade him down and you can move someone up. And I think the thing as well is that if you are going to move that player out, we can probably agree that ideally we're moving that player out because something's changed with our projection. Like, say, for Matt Burton, if we're just going to roll with him for a moment, if Toby Sexton, say, maybe takes more of the kicking or Stephen Crichton steals the goal kicking off him, that might be a reason for us to maybe trade him out. But if Matt Burton just has a couple of slow scores to start with, we're probably going to back our research in, aren't we?
Exactly right. And you can't just knee-jerk react, trade these players out as well. You've picked them as keepers for a reason and pods for a reason. So steer the course unless you see something drastic that you weren't accounting for when you were doing your projections.
Yeah, that's it. Pick those guys, stick with them for a few weeks. In this modern fantasy, potentially you might have to move a bit quicker, but that's something we're going to touch on in subsequent episodes. But brings us to the end of this one. Brenton, what are the key takeaways from this episode?
Yep. So the key takeaways, as you can see on the chalkboard there, generally the high ownership players are owned for a reason. There's a lot of good coaches out there who do a lot of good research, listen to a lot of content as well of projections and giving good reasons why these players are highly owned and why you should be taking them. And Pod's point of difference is they do elevate your risk level, but pick players based on their value, not the ownership. So if you see the magic number's 10. If you see 10 points of value, that means they're going to make you nearly $150,000 to then make moves later on in the season. That's what you do it on. Don't just pick them just because they are 50% owned for the sake of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that wraps up this episode number 11 of Back to Basics. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. Talking League Shorts. And if you love what you're seeing, don't be afraid to share an episode with a mate. We'll be back in episode number 12 with setting up your team for round 1. But it's bye for now.